Hello, everyone, and welcome to my final blog post. I hope the ordeal of finals has not been too brutal for you, and that maybe by this point you are beginning to enjoy your break. For this blog post, I will be discussing Russian realism and the characters within it. Though this movement is said to have sprung from beneath Gogol's legendary Overcoat, and I do draw attention to that on this introductory slide, it is a movement of far too much variation and dynamism to be defined by the works of just one man. Perhaps the strongest underlying current within realism, however, is the use of characterization to examine and draw attention to the perceived failings of the Russian state, as well as to reflect upon, and at times urge on, the burgeoning social and ideological movements within Russian society. The centrality of political and ideological commentary to realism was due in large part to the repressive nature of the Russian state, as this quote from Sasha St. John Murphy's piece on the depiction of nihilism in Russian literature demonstrates. Literature became the central forum for topical discussions among educated Russians, and beginning with Gogol's St. Petersburg Tales, such discussion became the most fundamental impetus for storytelling within the empire. These politically rich works were then employed by literary critics, such as Vissarion Belinsky, pictured to the left, and later Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who's pictured to the right, to formulate broad arguments about the shape of the Russian Empire and the necessary direction of its future. Now, with that background out of the way, let's take a dive into some of these characters. Our first character is Major Kovalyev, the unfortunate protagonist of one of Gogol's Petersburg Tales, his outrageous 1836 short story, The Nose. An example of the clerk archetype, for which Gogol is quite well known. Major Kovalyev is a one-dimensional character that serves as the object of caricature and ridicule. He, however, draws even less empathy than Gogol's other iconic clerks, lacking the inspirational, if ultimately doomed, perseverance of Akaky Akakiyevich, or the humanizing cries of the poor madman who proclaimed himself to be the king of Spain. The flatness of Kovalyev is intentional and effective. He operates as a stand-in for the countless mid-ranking bureaucrats that populated St. Petersburg, and reflects Gogol's belief that Russia's Western-styled bureaucracy had created a society of automatons incapable of independent thought. Kovalyev's loss of his nose should have awakened him to the reality of his meaningless existence and the ridiculousness of his devotion to an arbitrary set of ranks. After all, his nose usurped this order by removing itself from his face and taking on the dress of a state counselor. Yet while Kovalyev was indignant that the nose did not know its place as it should have, he failed to surmise from his experience the silliness of hierarchy in general, and upon his nose's return to its proper place, went back to his life of behaving sanctimoniously towards those ranked below him and obsequiously to those ranked above him. This failure to learn, or even to reflect, is perhaps the most negative of Kovalyev's wholly unlikable character. Now let's turn to Bazarov from Turgenev's iconic novel, Fathers and Children. Turgenev, like Gogol, concerned himself with exposing the flaws of society. He, however, went about this with deep and sympathetic characterization, rather than the biting satire, and proposed a foil to his depiction of the young radical generation's misguided path in Arkady. Perhaps the deepest and most complex character we have examined in this course, Bazarov is defined by his commitment to principles that are incompatible with humanity and his internal battle to suppress the natural human instincts that still live within him. So convinced of the necessity to expose and destroy the moral rot within society, he was unable to truly contribute to it, despite his remarkable intellect and talent. In this way, and in his devotion to clearing the ground, and even failing to do that and not building, he seemed himself, he seemed to, as he himself expressed in his deathbed, be somewhat superfluous, though he does not fit into our classical understanding of the archetype. Among the most negative elements of Bazarov's character was his objectifying and belittling attitude towards women, an attitude he embraced because of his deep-seated fear of losing control and becoming one of the romantics he so despised. His admission of love to Odintsova, as you will see in the quote on the right, was a physical manifestation of the failure of his resolve to overcome his own human nature. It was passion breaking through, even as he attempted to hold it in. Though Turgenev claimed his characterization was simply aimed at depicting a phenomenon he saw growing within society, this cannot be said to be strictly true. The novel's end, in which Bazarov's loving parents visit their son's grave, is a testament to the enduring nature of those ideals that Bazarov had denied in life, but that he in death embraced. The character of Arkady, moreover, who espoused both new learning and the more traditional ideas of marital union and familial bonds, likewise served as a model for the future, rather than the cautionary tale that Bazarov ultimately reflected. The use of characterization to portray generational movements continued with Sofia Kovalevskaya's Vera Vorontsova, a woman who willingly and happily gave her entire life to what she called the cause. Far less reflective or paralyzed by internal struggle than Bazarov, Vera's only goal in life is martyrdom, and her one struggle is her difficulty of finding a way. It is her difficulty in finding a means to achieve it. In Vera, we can see parallels with other female characters written by women that we have come across. Though she is not abused by her family, like the protagonist of Antonina or the boarding school girl, she nonetheless falls into the archetype of a young woman seeking independence, autonomy, and a sort of spiritual and personal purpose. Like Lolenka and the boarding school girl, she is awakened to the true and unfavorable workings of Russian life, to the words and teachings of an older man. The radical Vasilitsev, even after his death, informed Vera's purpose, as he intended to do with his note, and he appeared to her as if a voice from the other world was speaking to her, urging her on towards martyrdom. Unlike Bazarov, Vera was legitimately unimpacted by a desire for romantic love, at least after her ill-fated relationship with Vasilitsev, and expressed incredulity that it could even be mentioned as a motive for her actions. Likewise, though her portrayal is far more simple than that of Bazarov, and her character more naive, Vera's unflinching passion and commitment makes her a truly inspirational figure. Her smiling face as she embarked for Siberia, it's yelling to the narrator, "Oh, if only you knew how much I pity all of you who are staying here," almost seems to beckon other readers towards their own martyrdom, and stands as a marked contrast to Bazarov's sad end. Now we will turn to Nikolai Vysotsky's Lefty, which, though is written nearly 50 years after The Nose, resembles the Gogolian tradition of realism far more than it does that of Turgenev or Kovalevskaya. Vysotsky brings his own authorial identity to the work, of course, with his skaz framing and his sort of oral tradition that he embraces. But his humorous indictment of the Russian bureaucracy cannot but bring up the image of Gogol. His character Lefty is a simple character, pious, unpretentious, and thoroughly devoted to his native country. Skilled beyond belief with his hands and keenly intelligent, though not formally trained, he is capable and willing of great service to his fatherland. Yet this service is unable to come to fruition due to the ineffectiveness and banal cruelty of the Russian state, which ultimately left him dying away from family or kin on a hospital floor. His last words, which would have aided the inept military and helped the Russians avert disaster in Crimea, were never even transmitted to the Tsar. Though far from the most complex of these characters, Lefty could be said to be the most pure and moral. His death, though simply told, was a sharp condemnation of the Russian government, though, like Gogol, Lyskov seems to have been more critical of the Western-style bureaucracy and not of the Tsar or autocracy itself. Our final character is Nikolai Ivanich of Chekhov's short story, Gooseberries. Yet another relatively flat, one-dimensional figure, Nikolai Ivanich is, despite not doing anything wrong in the traditional sense of the word, portrayed quite negatively. He is a man who, devoted his life not to doing good, but on achieving enough prosperity to be truly lazy and to play king within his own little fiefdom. In a sense, he devoted his life to superfluousness, to a sort of self-conscious Oblomovism, in which he could just eat his gooseberries greedily, one after another, with no other cares in the world. That is at least how the narrator of our story, his brother Ivan Ivanich, sees it. One of the interesting things about Nikolai Ivanich, however, is that his sins are ones that most every one of us, as well as the narrator, as well as Ivan Ivanich, his brother, himself, have committed. Ivan Ivanich comes to hate happiness because of Nikolai, because he realizes that Nikolai, as well as himself, is only happy on the backs of others suffering, and that he has devoted his life to achieving a happiness by ignoring the plight of others. And this, as Ivan Ivanich believes, is the only way happiness can be achieved. And that happiness is itself immoral. Yet while Ivan Ivanich is convinced of this, Chekhov does not really tell us what he thinks. Perhaps this really is a morality tale in which Ivan Ivanich has discovered the truth, as is often the case in Tolstoyan tales of his later period, but perhaps not. Chekhov seems to want us to decide. His story is purposely enigmatic, and he does not really bring his own personal views into the picture. This itself is worthy of note, the standoffishness of Chekhov. He is one of the only authors really we've read this semester, who doesn't really attempt to impart a clear message. Gogol has been said by some to be similar, but I have been largely unconvinced by those claims, and believe we can, at least to an extent, surmise Gogol's opinions and his views and his intentions from his work. Chekhov is much more difficult with. And so I hope that this presentation has been able to demonstrate to you that though Russian realism may have emerged from Gogol's Overcoat, it is far from his sole possession. It is a varied tradition, and though all of these authors do attempt to engage with issues of Russian governance, the Russian state, and the shape of Russian society, as well as the country's future, they do so in different styles and with different motivations. We also don't see any sort of clear linear progression in the way these styles evolve. Chekhov and Lyskov actually maybe resemble more Gogol in their approach, while towards the middle we have sort of more kind of explicit statements or views on the country's future. For this reason, I will come back to a point I think I've made before, is that though we often tend to hear the same sort of names in discussions of Russian literature, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Pushkin, 20th century, maybe Nabokov and Lolita, and we hear about the same books, we see them in the movies, if we watch any films at all. Russian literature really is far more diverse than this. And I think we really should try to appreciate and embrace that diversity. A second thing I really realized over this course, as my attention was drawn time after time to the intentions within these stories, and the wish to kind of have a discourse on political and ideological ideas, is that even if the Russian democratic state did somehow produce one of the greatest literary traditions we've ever known, that is somewhere we never want to be, and that we are very happy, that we are very lucky to have the sort of government we do have today, no matter how flawed it may be, where we are able to directly engage, or if not directly, almost directly engage and impact our government and the shape of our society, where we can vote or protest or say what we want about the government without being censored and without facing retribution. And with the rise of autocracies throughout the world, including Russia's own, this is something we should not be complacent about. And it is something that we need to actively strengthen as a country, this democracy of ours, and improve upon, and not risk letting it go and fade into oblivion. So with that, on that strange note, I want to wish everybody a great break. It's been a fun semester, and I hope you enjoy the next month off before we get back into whatever work we have to do next semester. So thank you all for listening, and have a great break.